The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is the last of the 6 units that we're doing, and I should apologise again to you up front that this was the very first unit when I had that unfortunate accident with my laptop, and since then I bought a new one, so I'm all fine now. So I apologise for the inconvenience that's caused. So we'll continue from here. Welcome. I'll obviously send you a copy of the slides. I'll also send you a copy of the recording as well at the end of this. So you'll receive that either today or tomorrow. So I just want to do a quick sound check to make sure that everybody's on board. So if you just go over to the question box there, just on the right-hand side, could I just ask you to type in the word clear, just in the question box? That basically lets me know that I'm not talking to myself for the next hour. Could I just get people to type in the word clear in the question box? Thanks, Tom. Welcome too. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. Welcome. Welcome, Annette. Okay, thank you. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. Thank you. There's a whole lot of other people responding as well. I can't keep up with that. So thank you, and let's get underway with the program. So what you can see on your screen now, of course, is the units that we've covered in the Lunch and Learn, and you'll notice they're a little bit out of order because we've got, went too far. You'll notice that the characteristics of high-performing teams, which was essentially going to be Unit 1, is now at, well, Unit 6, I guess, but basically we've gone through a fair bit of territory over the last couple of months, and I hope you've had an opportunity to apply what you've learned and tried a few things, and really, if you have tried a few things, you're probably getting some serious benefits from the program already. So today I'm going to run through some tips on high-performing teams and get you to have a think about your team and its own performance and what you might be able to do to accelerate its own performance. So there's basically 3 things that we're going to do out of today's session. First of all, I'm going to share with you part of a book that I've got written and is about to be published by Wiley's in March next year. So the good news for you is that you're getting I guess, an early version of this. So we're going to look at the 10 characteristics of high-performing teams. This comes from my own experience. It also comes from research, and I'll share that with you. I've also used some examples from great sporting teams as well in the book. I'll obviously give you some examples of, or I'll get you actually to give me some examples of high-performing teams, and I'll also ask you or share with you some tools that you can use to accelerate these characteristics of the high-performing team so that you can improve your own team output. And that'll take us through pretty much to the top of the hour. So if you've got any questions, any comments, any observations, I'd welcome your comments and observations. You just go to the question box, type in your question, make your comment. I'm the only one that gets to see that, and of course I'll refer to it as soon as I see it. So I guess the first thing I want to do is ask you a question, and I'd like you to have a think about this. I think many of you probably enjoy sport as I do, and I'd ask you this question, and if you've got the answer to this question, please type it in the question box. So what are some examples of high-performing teams in the world of sport? So anyone like to sort of volunteer, just think of one team in the world of sport that you think would be a high-performing team, and just indicate what that team would be, and let's just see if we can get some examples of high-performing teams in the world of sport. All right, so just type in your comment or your question or your example there. All right, John just says the All Blacks. Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, interesting that you should say that, John, because my book that's coming out, which is titled The 8 Keys to Winning Teams, focuses very much on the All Blacks and what a lot of things that they do off the field, which makes a huge effort on the field. In fact, the All Blacks have got an 83% win rate, and I find it difficult to mention this because I'm an Australian, and of course I'm pretty much used to us getting beaten year in, year out, although we did have a victory early this year, a rare victory I might say. But the All Blacks do a lot of interesting things that lead up to high performance. So the work that they do off the field is just as important as what they do on the field. Has anyone else got any other examples of high performing teams they'd like to mention? Because now's your opportunity to type in a team. Okay, so we've got here the Manchester United. Okay, I'm not a soccer fan, but I'll take your word for it. So I'm sure they at times have been high performing teams, a high performing team. Anyone else? All right, well, there's a couple of examples, and I think we can take a lot of examples from the world of sport and look at some of the things that they're doing and consider how they might impact on the world of business. And I'm sure there are some parallels there that we can look at. So let's move on and have a look at the 8 characteristics of high performing teams. Now, the model that you're seeing in front of you now is pretty close to the model that I've got in my book. And, you know, it's quite possible that there are other characteristics of high performing teams. In fact, I'm sure there is. But I would say to you that these 8 characteristics are critical for high performance in a team. And you'll notice that on the model that they're all interrelated. So what that means, the good news is that if you work on one characteristic, it's likely to impact positively on other characteristics. By the same token, that's the good news. The bad news is if one of these characteristics is missing, then it's likely that your team is probably missing a couple of characteristics. For example, you'll notice that building trust is one of the characteristics. You'll also notice that sharing leadership is another. So if a leader doesn't share the leadership in a team, in other words, help other people or encourage other people to be part of the decision-making process, it's likely to lead to a reduction in trust. Likewise, if there's a high trust level, it's a little easier for the team leader, of course, to involve their team in decision-making. So you can see that there are some parallels they're all interrelated, and that's why the model is the way it is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spend a bit of time going through each of these characteristics, and then I'm going to spend a bit of time doing that. And then when I've done that, I'm going to share with you some practical tips on some things that you can do immediately, this afternoon, in fact. But I would say this to you, that you don't have to actually deal with all 8 of these at once. In fact, that's a bit overwhelming and it's impractical. We're all busy people, and it's probably not possible to do that. So what I suggest you do is to pick the one characteristic that you think is probably going to give you the greatest leverage in your team, and then build on that. And by doing that, what will happen is, of course, you'll positively impact on other characteristics. And if you do that, of course, you are leveraging one characteristic against several. So the whole idea is to pick one that you think is relevant. It may not necessarily be the one that you think is the most lacking. It might be the one that's the low-hanging fruit. You know, it's a little bit easy to implement. But I'll leave that decision to you, and you could probably imagine that the homework that I'm going to give you is very much around working on one of those characteristics. So I won't talk about these. I'll go straight into the first characteristic, which is sense of purpose. So all high-performing teams, whether they're on the sporting field or whether they're in the world of work, have a very clear sense of purpose. They know what they're supposed to do, they know how to do it, they know when to do it, and they know what they're going to be measured by. So part of being a good team leader, of course, is creating a sense of purpose. And part of that sense of purpose is actually creating very clear expectations of your team. And a lot of managers and a lot of team leaders believe that they do that already, but in reality, it's not quite as simple as it might sound. Because if you think about, a sporting team, it's a fairly obvious purpose. The purpose, of course, is to win the game. So it's very simple. But in the world of work, it's not quite so simple. Of course, we want to win the game, but the game is not a single score. There's a whole range of variables involved. Good quality service, timeliness, safety. There's a whole range of things that come into play with regard to that. So setting expectations is critically important. So let's actually have a look at the whole idea of managing expectations. Now, there are 7 key questions I want to ask you, and I want you to answer these just silently and think about whether you're doing these things. Because if you're not doing any of these 7 things, what's actually happening is that you're probably not sharpening the saw. In other words, the purpose of your team is not as clear as it could be. So let's start with the very first question. The very first question is, what are your expectations as a leader? Now, that might seem like a very straightforward question. You may have a very straightforward answer to that, and that's good. But the very first and obvious place to start is to think, what are my expectations as a leader of not only what we do, but how we do it? Now, I'm going to make the assumption that you already have worked out what that is. You may not have communicated it, but you'd certainly have some idea, I'm sure, in your mind about what that would look like. So let's take the second question. Let's assume that it's very clear what your expectations are. The next key question you've got to ask yourself is, have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, again, you may think you've done this. You may have had the odd team meeting where you've explained certain expectations to people. Perhaps you've given feedback on performance. Maybe there are a few people in your team that you've given the briefing to as to what your expectations are. But the trouble with communicating expectations is you have to do it moment by moment, situation by situation, project by project, task by task. In other words, it's never ending. You must continually do it, and what I would say is to be consistent and persistent. By being consistent means the same message is coming through loud and clear, and persistent means I continue to discuss and talk about my expectations. Now, just because you've done that does not necessarily mean that we've created purpose, because another question might then be, do your team members understand your expectations? Now, most people in your team are not going to say to you, look, I don't understand what you mean. They just simply walk away wondering. And it might be a difficult question for you to answer, but do your team have a very clear understanding of your expectations? Because obviously, if they don't, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to meet those expectations. And by just asking people and saying, do you understand, is not always a good question, because the majority of times people will say yes, even though they don't. So they've got to understand what your expectations are. Now, if they understand your expectations, the next step is, do they accept them? So I can understand what your expectation is, but do I actually accept it as fair and reasonable is another question. Because obviously if people don't accept your expectations, they're highly unlikely, even though they understand them, to meet them. So, for example, if you set someone a high budget and they don't believe they're going to meet it, then they're clearly not going to accept the expectation. Or if you give them unrealistic timelines, at least in their mind, they're not going to accept that expectation. So we need to get people to accept the expectation, because it's only through acceptance that we can gain a sense of commitment, which is the very next question. The very next question is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? So I can understand them, I can accept them, but I've also got 10 balls in the air that I'm juggling at once, as we all do in the workplace. So, we've got conflicting priorities left, right, and centre, and all of a sudden you've got another commitment that you want met. And the question then is that commitment high on the list of the person who it's directed to? Now, the very best way of getting someone's commitment to your expectation is to actually ask them. So what you say to someone is, can I get your commitment to complete this by the close of business today? Or can I get you to can I get your commitment to complete this report? Or whatever it might be. And then what you do is you're hoping for a nod or a grunt or a yes. In other words, you want some sort of verbal or non-verbal commitment. And interesting enough, when you get people's non-verbal or verbal commitment, they're more likely to commit because they don't want to go back on their word. So I suggest you ask for that commitment. Certainly it's not a good idea to assume that you're going to get it, which is what a lot of team leaders do. We assume that people will just commit to it because we happen to have communicated it to people. So ask people for their commitment, and do that because by doing that, you're bumping up your odds and your opportunity to get that done. Now, let's assume that you've communicated your expectations, that people actually understand them, they've accepted them, and they've also committed to them. Surely that's the end of it. But no, there are two other questions you need to consider. One of those questions are, do your team members know how they're performing against those expectations? So in other words, if you're not giving clear, timely, relevant feedback, then people aren't really clear about whether they're meeting your commitments, your expectations or not. So feedback is critically important. So, so if people exceed your expectations, you should let them know. If people haven't met your expectations, you should let them know, because the more you do that, the more people feel secure about the expectation and whether they've met it or not. And the very final question you've got to ask yourself is this: am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, what I mean by that is maybe someone's skill level is low. Are you coaching them? Perhaps there are organisational blocks in the way. Are you trying to remove those? So, for example, if somebody outside your team is supposed to give your team some information, maybe they're supposed to give you a report in a timely fashion. If they don't do that, then obviously one of your team members is not going to be able to achieve their task. And if that's the case, the question then is, are you doing everything that you can to remove that roadblock? In other words, get people to perhaps commit to what they need to do outside the team so that your team can actually manage their own expectations. So you can see that it's quite a complex arrangement. And if you answer no to any of those questions, then obviously you need to go back and think more clearly about it, and as to how you might give those, how you might express those expectations that you have of your team members. So that's about creating purpose. And if you can do that, then that's a good step in the right direction. And it's very much around, obviously, communication. Let's look at the second one. Now, the second characteristic of a high-performing team is open communication. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that people are feeling comfortable and open to express their point of view, particularly if they are against other people in the team. So all high-performing teams have a robust system where people are comfortable expressing their point of view, that they feel valued as part of the team to a point where they're willing to share that information. Now, as you can imagine, trust's got a lot to do with this. So if there's a high trust level in your team, then it's likely that there's going to be open information or open communication. Equally, if there's open information or open communication, it's quite likely that trust levels will build. So, as I said earlier on, if you can master one of these characteristics, it's likely that another will benefit from that. So what this really requires is for you to have regular conversations with your team members. And I'm not talking about in a team meeting only, although that's one avenue. I'm also suggesting that you need to have informal check-ins with each of your team members. On a regular basis, you need to get together with them and talk to them one-on-one. Because by doing that, what you're doing is you're building a working relationship up with each team member. And by building a working relationship up with each team member, you are actually improving communication channels. You're opening them up and you're giving people an opportunity to have a say. People are often feeling a little bit more comfortable talking with you one-on-one sometimes than they would be in a team situation. So here's a little tool that might assist you in that regard. And this tool that I'm going to share with you, as you can see on your screen now, is called the 5 Conversations Framework. Now, the 5 Conversations Framework's been around for a few years. I developed it in 2013 as part of my book on the end of the performance review. And I'm proud to say there are public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit organisations all over the world that are using this strategy to build open channels of communication with team members. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there are 5 months. So the argument is for you to have 5 short conversations with each team member, 1 conversation a month with each team member. And these conversations should be about 10, 15 minutes long. They shouldn't go any longer than that because we're all busy people. But you'll find that if you invest the time in this, you will most likely develop open channels of communication. So in month 1, you'll notice there's a climate review. Now, a climate review looks at job satisfaction, it looks at morale, and it looks at communication. So the very first question you might ask somebody during this conversation is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how do you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, it really doesn't matter what score they give it. They might say a 5. Then you ask why, and then you listen carefully to what they've got to say. And of course, then the follow-up is, how can we get it from a 5 to a 6? What do I need to do or not do as your team leader to assist you to get your satisfaction from a 5 to a 6 or whatever it might be? So organisations spend tens of thousands of dollars a year doing these engagement surveys online, when I just think it's probably just a good idea to have a conversation about it. So once you've had that conversation, you move on to conversation 2, which is strengths and talents. Now, a strengths and talents conversation is actually focusing on what people are doing right. So what you do is you ask people what they enjoy in their work most of all. All right, now, why do I suggest that? Because if there is clear evidence in the research to show that what people enjoy in their work, there's a high correlation between what they enjoy and what they're good at. So, for example, if someone says to you, well, I enjoy the client interaction, well, it's probably likely that they're very good at that as well. And so what we're doing here is we're creating an upward spiral of positivity by working on what your team members are actually good at to start with. We'll get to what they're not so good at the moment. And by doing that, you can start to build on that, create an understanding, and hopefully be able to implement or give that person more opportunity to do that if it's possible. And if it's not, you just need to let them know that. Now, conversation 3 is opportunities for growth. So that's the other side. And so people are now going to talk about areas that they need to work on. And I should also say that these conversations, people should come to them already prepared. So knowing full well that you're having these conversations with people, they should be ready with the answer. They should have thought carefully about it before they come to you, so that they're not blindsided. And then so that you're sitting there and they'll come to you with something and you can work on that. Now, conversation 4 is a learning and development conversation. Now, out of conversation 2 and 3, strengths and talents and opportunities for growth, there's likely to be some learning that will come out of that. So what conversation 4 does is look at what that learning might be. And I'm not necessarily suggesting this is about sending people off to training courses. Not at all. This could well be about you coaching them. It could be about you buddying them up with someone else. It could be about you explaining something a bit clearer. There's a whole range of possibilities that would be included in that informal learning and development sphere. And conversation 5 is innovation and continuous improvement, whereas conversation 4 is about themselves and how they can improve, through learning and development. Conversation 5 is about how the workplace can be improved. And again, if you preempt this and ask people to think about this before you meet with them, then you're not sitting there having an awkward silence while they contemplate the question. So what we want here is people bringing their ideas to you to talk about how they can improve the workplace, what they need to do in order to make that happen. So there's the 5 conversations. It works really well, and I'd strongly recommend that you think about implementing a structure like that, and you have these regular check-ins once a month. Now, if you're interested in using this model in your own workplace and you'd like some more information about it, contact me via email. I'm happy to talk to you about some ways and means of doing that, and perhaps some of the questions that you can ask and so forth. So that's the 5 conversations framework, and by doing that you are opening up communication, which is critically important to your success as a team leader. Let's move on to the next characteristic. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, our next characteristic is that of building trust and mutual respect. Now, obviously, that would be one that you'd be well aware of, that is critically important to any team success. Now, without trust, there's not much you can do. Now, trust will ebb and flow. The other thing about trust is it takes a long time to get people's trust, but of course it can be eroded very quickly as well. So it's one of those things that's dynamic. You can never say that you've arrived. So what the idea is that there's always an opportunity to build trust levels up in your team. So what makes up trust between you and the team leaders? There are a number of characteristics that we know for sure. Some of them will be very obvious to you, and let's have a look at some of those characteristics. Some of the characteristics that build up levels of trust are these. And I'll just run through them very briefly, and some of them are very obvious, but the question you've got to ask yourself is, am I doing all of these things? If you are doing all these things, then it's likely that you're building an environment of trust. And if you've got an environment of trust, then of course you're building this characteristic. So if we start at the top there, and you can see sincerity. Sincerity basically means authenticity. Basically, it means that you are very open and genuine in your approach. So, for example, if you've made a mistake, then it's a good idea to apologise for making that mistake. If you don't know the answer to something, instead of trying to bluff your way through it, you actually indicate to people that you don't know. So people are led by a human being who happens to be a team leader, not a team leader that happens to be a human being. So people want to know that you're relatable, you're human, you're sincere, you're authentic. You also need to be very reliable, and what that means is, of course, that you do what you say and you say what you do. So in other words, there's a consistency. You're modeling the behavior. People can actually see that what you're suggesting to them is something that you already adopt yourself. So if you say one thing and do another, you're going to get yourself into a bit of strife when it comes to trust. The other thing is commitment. People need to see that you're committed. In other words, that you'll follow through. So you're in the corridor, someone asks you if you could look into something and you forget about it, well, that will erode trust. So in other words, the idea is that you'll constantly follow through on what you've suggested. And of course, what this means is under promise and over deliver, not over deliver and under promise. In other words, you need to give people, if you promise something, you must deliver on it. You must commit to it. Integrity means that what you see is what you get. So it basically means that when you say something, your actions are consistent with what you say, so that people have a sense of psychological safety in terms of how they deal with you. Competence, now I would imagine you have been promoted into your position of team leader because you have some technical competence. Most team leaders have been promoted for that very reason. And obviously, if you've got technical know-how, then it does add a level of trust, because people can think to themselves, well, you know what's going on, you know how I operate, you know what the job entails. So I'm assuming that that's a given. Consistency means that you treat people fairly, you treat people equally, you are consistent in your instructions, your temper is even. All of those sorts of things contribute to trust. Now, as I said before, if you're doing all of those things, then it's likely that you're creating an environment where trust will flourish. And of course, if you're not doing those things, the opposite is true. So it all starts with you as a team leader, and you need to constantly demonstrate these characteristics in order to gain people's trust. I must admit that even if you do that, you may not, because some people are not very trusting. And of course, there is a obligation on behalf of the team member to trust as well, but all you can do is create an environment for that to occur. Now, the next characteristic, and we have talked about this in the Lunch and Learn series, in particular in units 1 and 2, the first 2 sessions I did with you, and that is to share leadership. Now, not every decision that's made should be shared. Obviously, if you've got to make a quick decision, you won't have time to talk to people. You just have to make the decision and get on with it. But I think if you're not sharing the leadership, then what's happening is people are being too reliant on you. They just come to you whenever they have a problem. They don't think through how they can solve it. So what I suggest you do in your team meetings is try to have 50% of it as reporting, which is normal process, and the other 50% around shared leadership. In other words, throw problems on the table, get people's opinion, ask for feedback, and get people involved in the process. By doing that, you're sharing the leadership. So it's important that you do that. And you might recall I shared a model with you on situational leadership. And situational leadership is a process that says that depending on what the situation is will depend on my response to that. Let's have a look at that model again. You'll recall this model from earlier slides, and you'll know that at different stages, depending on the situation, you're required to exhibit a certain leadership style. Now, you'll notice that some of these leadership styles are less about shared leadership. For example, in that red space there around directing, obviously, there are certain things that people expect from you, and you're supposed to make decisions on the spot and be quite decisive. But coaching is more of a shared leadership approach. So is supporting, and so is delegating. So it depends on the situation as to which of those 4 styles that Blanchard talks about that you may use. So I'm hoping that through the Lunch and Learn series, you've learned to just vary your leadership style depending on the circumstances that you're in at the time. All right, so has anyone got any questions at this stage? Anyone like to make a comment or ask a question in relation to the characteristics that I've covered so far. I'm conscious that I probably haven't given you much of an opportunity to have a say. So if you've got a question or comment, type it in. I'll pick it up straight away, and I'll certainly deal with it right on the spot. Not really? Okay, well, we'll keep moving. The next characteristic of a high-performing team is having effective working procedures. Now, your team has a series of procedures by which it goes about its business. And the important thing for you is to make sure that those working procedures are working well. Now, that might require you throwing out a procedure or replacing it with another procedure, or even eliminating a procedure, or even implementing a procedure. So the systems and the processes that you use in your team have got to make sense, have got to be simple, and they've got to be adhered to. Now, to complicate things, of course, the organisation of which you're part of, there are a whole lot of other procedures outside the team, and even procedures between your team and other teams. And of course, you have less say in what you can do about those procedures because they're outside the team. But within your team, you've got plenty of scope to be able to monitor and evaluate the procedures you use. And again, I'd use shared leadership here. I'd ask people to come up with ways and means of doing things faster, quicker, safer, all of those things. So what procedures are working for you, and what procedures are not working for you, and what can you do about that? Now, any high-performing team is always monitoring their systems, their processes, their routines, all of the things that make up the team. A simple procedure is your team meetings. Are they working for you? Are you having too many meetings? Are you not having enough? Are the meetings too long? Are the meetings too short? What could you do to make those meetings more engaging? So that's a procedure that would be one of the first things that I'd look at if I was in your position. So let's have a look at some of the parameters around procedures that are really important. What you see on your screen now, of course, is 8 dimensions of innovation and continuous improvement. So you might want to ask yourselves these questions when you look at your systems, procedures, and routines. How can we improve the quality of what we do? So you are either in the business of generating services or generating products. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, how can we improve what we're doing? How can we improve the quality of what we're doing? So that's obviously a really important question, because every team sinks and swims on the basis of what they produce or not produce. How can we reduce the time it takes to get things done? So, for example, other teams in the organisation depend on you. And the question then is, how can you get things done and processed quickly through your team without compromising, of course, on quality? How can I reduce the costs involved in work in the team? Now, the costs may be about time. So whenever anything takes time in your team, it's got a cost associated with it, because obviously the more time and the more people in your team involved in something, the more costly that is when you work out hourly rates and all the rest of it. It does cost money. So that's important. So how do you increase your output? So you might be producing X output. How can you increase that? Is it possible? Are there ways of doing that without stretching people too far? Discuss it with your team. How can I increase safety, which is critically important for workers indoor and outdoor? So what are some of the safety issues? What can we do to alleviate potential accidents? What can we do to improve safety overall? Normally that's done with a safety committee, but certainly as a team leader, there's no reason why you can't think about that a little bit closer in terms of your own team. How can we meet deadlines? Now, all teams have deadlines to meet, whether it's a customer deadline, whatever it might be, there is a deadline for you to meet. And so the question is, how can we make sure that we're meeting our deadlines? Are the deadlines realistic? Are there things that we're doing that are creating roadblocks towards the end of deadlines? What can we do about that? Now, another important area that's often underestimated when we consider procedures is enhancing interpersonal cooperation. The fact of the matter is, your team would not be existing and thriving unless there was good, healthy, robust working relationships with other members of the team and even people outside the team if you deal with customers. So it's important to think about that. So what can you do? I mean, if there's a relationship, for example, with someone else outside the team that's not working very well for you, then, you might have a justification for thinking that they're doing the wrong thing by you. But the reality is your team effectiveness and production and productivity is being affected by a inferior interpersonal relationship. So what can you do as a team to build that up? So what can you also do to streamline your systems and processes? Could you get rid of a process? Could you change a process? Could you simplify a process? What can be done within your team? Now, what you're seeing on your screen here is an excellent opportunity to have a discussion. You can discuss this, as I said, in the 5 conversations framework, or you can get your team together and toss around a few ideas. Or maybe something's gone wrong in the past and you don't want it to happen again. There's the perfect opportunity for you to have a conversation about how you might improve the systems and processes associated with that. All right, so that is the procedures characteristic. Now let's talk about building on differences, and I think we've done a fair bit of work with this with Chris Burton when he gave that excellent presentation about a month ago on team roles. So what you've got to try and do is work out what people enjoy doing and what they've got a predisposition towards, and defer to them when you need that information. You might recall this particular model from about a month ago, and Chris went through all this with you. He used the team management profile as an example. There are other systems out there, but you could do a lot worse than put your team through this process and to actually identify what their preferred roles are, and then to start to think, well, how can we use those preferred roles in our conversations around teamwork? So obviously, if any of these 8 roles are missing in your team, it's likely that you'll be a suboptimal team. So the whole idea, of course, is to start thinking a little bit differently and outside the box around people's preferences in a team. All right, moving on. The next one is flexibility and adaptability. All teams need to be flexible and adaptable. And if you look at any high-performing team, they're flexible and they're adaptable, right? Not inflexible and rigid, which is the opposite. So, and of course, if you're in the public sector versus the private sector, it can make a difference as well, because public sector organisations are pretty much bound by bureaucracy and regulation. And because of that, they are less likely to be flexible and adaptable. But I would argue that that's even more of a reason to discuss this further with your team. So teams have to be, because the world's changing so quickly, your customers are changing quickly, and so everything is in flux. And as a result of that, your team has to be able to adapt to those circumstances. Here's a little framework that might help you with that. If you look at the decisions that have to be made in your team, they can basically be put in 3 categories. In the yellow, there are decisions that must follow a process. So these are things like safety and regulatory type, decisions, that there is a clearly defined process or system that has to be followed. And you expect people to follow it, and you would follow it, and that would be your expectation. Now, if we go to the orange before I deal with the blue, right at the bottom, you've got there decisions where initiative is expected. So these are decisions where people have to think on their feet. There is no process, there is no procedure necessarily. So people have the freedom to make a decision about how they deal with something. So they're the two extremes. And then you've got a blue area in here where the decisions can either be made by following a process or showing initiative, depending on what it is that you're talking about. So what I'd suggest you might like to do in one of your team meetings is you get a whiteboard and you draw 3 columns, and in one column over on the left hand side you say decisions that must follow the process, and you ask your team members to indicate to you what those decisions are. You won't have any problem filling that column up. Then you go to the other end, which is the orange end, and you say, what are all the decisions that we have to make either individually or as a team that don't have a system, that have to be made on the spot where initiative needs to be shown. Now you'll find that might be a little bit more difficult and people a bit more challenged about filling that column out. And now I've got the two extremes, and what you could basically say is that in those circumstances there, I'll back you. I'm happy for you to show initiative in those cases if indeed you believe that it's important and you agree with their comment. Now it's the blue area that'll give you grief, because in the blue area people can either follow the system or show initiative. Now you ask again, what sort of decisions do we make in a team, either individually or collectively, that can either be done via following a system or process or through showing initiative? Now, this is important because what people will do normally, if they don't feel safe, is that they will have a tendency, given a choice, to follow a process. And then, of course, if things don't go right, they can cover their backside, can't they? And basically say, well, look, I was just following our procedures, so they can blame the procedures if it goes wrong. But in fact, it was probably important for them to show initiative in those cases. So talk about the things that are in the blue column, the middle column. Talk about the things that occur, the real life examples where people can follow the system or show initiative. Now, just by doing that exercise, you'll find that you're starting to clarify in people's mind when they can show initiative and when they need to follow the system. And what you do by doing that is you're creating a more flexible, adaptable workplace, which is precisely what you want, which of course is one of the characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, the final one of the 8 is that all high-performing teams are in a continual state of learning. And of course, that's a bit of a throwaway line when people say continuous learning. What do we actually mean by that? Basically, what that means in plain English is that we learn from our mistakes. And what it means is that we don't make the same mistake twice. So there is some sort of a debriefing process. So it allows people to reorientate their approach based on the mistakes that have been made. And let's face it, all teams make mistakes. So the best approach that I know for that is what the military call an after-action review. Now, an after-action review will occur in most military organisations, and any of you have had sort of a military background would completely understand this. So you can't really do anything in the military without doing an after-action review, which is pretty much a fancy word or words that can be referred to as a debrief. So when a project's done in your team, when a piece of work's been done in your team, when an activity's been done in your team, you ask 3 key questions. And these 3 questions are, what did we do well? So even if it was an absolute disaster, there's always something that's come up that was done well. So you ask people the question, we start with the positive first, what went well? And then you have a listen to what people are saying. You can contribute, agree or disagree, but you basically want people to talk about what went well. The second question that you then ask is what didn't go well. And even if something went perfectly, there's always something that didn't go as well as it could. And so you're asking people to review that and to give you some indications of what those things are. And then the third key question that you ask is then, what will we or you or us do differently next time? So what is the key learning out of this for us to apply next time we have a similar project or circumstance? Now, this is important because if you get your team involved in this debriefing process, then the old adage that people won't argue with their own data, in other words, because they have come up with it, not you, they have come up with it, it's likely that that will be done again. In other words, people will just, follow their own advice. And so it makes leadership very, very easy that way. Now, you might say, well, that takes a lot of time. We don't have time. That takes 5 minutes or maybe 15, 20 minutes, depending on how in depth you want to go with this. But I think by investing a little bit of time at the end of a project or at the end of a task, so at the end of a shift, for example, or at the end of a project that the team's been involved in, before you launch into the next big thing, just stop and ask those three questions. What went well? What didn't go well? And what will we do next time? And of course, it is one of the most powerful tools that I know, but unfortunately it's not being used enough in teams. So this is a great way to create a continuous learning culture in your team. So you're always trying to improve. Show me a great team and I'll show you a team that continually improves by building on the mistakes of the past to learn for the future. And that becomes extremely important. So try the after action review. It works extremely well. You'll be so pleasantly surprised at how it goes over. It's not hard to remember. You've just got 3 questions to remember, and you allow other people to contribute their answers to those 3 questions. So that's it, folks. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask, or any comments, any observations? Has anyone tried an after action review? Does anyone use it in their systems? Does anyone want to comment on that before we finish up? Or any of those other characteristics that you'd like to talk about? Because it's good to share your knowledge if you've got something that you want to share with the rest of the group. As I said at the outset, while you're thinking about that, you don't have to do all 8 things at once. In fact, I think that's not a practical way to go. It's just too much. It's too overwhelming. You'll have to stop. You'll have to down tools just to get through those 8 things. So what you do is you pick one of those areas, and this is, of course, what your homework is going to be. You pick one characteristic, right? One of those 8 characteristics, as I said at the outset, and you apply some of the tools that you've learned today to build that characteristic up. Now, by doing that, what you're going to do is impact positively on other characteristics that are in that model. And so therefore, you'll find that you will be actually improving your team overall and its performance by working on one characteristic initially, which will impact on others. So it works extremely well. All right, you're very quiet today, I note. So I'm pretty much done, and we're just actually almost ready to finish anyway. I'd just like to thank you all for the opportunity of working with you in the Lunch and Learn. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope that you've got something really useful out of it. I hope there's some things that you can take away with you. I'm hoping that there are some things that you can apply and use and improve the quality of your team, because ultimately that's what the Lunch and Learn series is all about. I'm always available on email if you want to send me an email, or you want to ask more questions, or you'd like more information. You're always welcome to send me an email. So with that, folks, I'd just like to say thank you very much. I've enjoyed working with you all. And again, I'm sorry about the early glitch in the program, but fortunately we've got everything up and running, and we've actually got through this first session that I was supposed to do right at the beginning. But that's okay. I bought myself a new laptop. I'm all back in business and raring to go. So thanks everyone. I've enjoyed working with you. And I guess the other thing I'd just say is have a really great weekend. And I wish you all the best in your journey of building a high performing team. Thank you and goodbye.